How are we doing, folks? My name is Paraplegic Sloth. Hello and welcome along to a trade tutorial mini-series for Europa Universalis 4. So, before we go into the introduction of trade and what trade is within Europa Universalis 4, we just need to spend a little bit of time talking about the DLC packs that pertain to trade mechanics in the game. Now, I don't want to spend too long waffling on about DLCs, so I'm just going to give you some recommended DLCs that you should have for trade purposes, and they are Eldorado, Wealth of Nations, Common Sense, and Dharma. If you want to be playing as a Merchant Republic or any kind of trade league, then I also recommend Mare Nostrum and Res Republica. And then if you just want absolutely everything trade, then there are three further more DLCs: Cradle of Civilization, the Cossacks, and Mandate of Heaven. Please remember that that is not my judgment on all of the DLC packs. That's just literally a list pertaining to the importance of trade mechanics, okay? Right, so let's jump into the game. Okay guys, so we're in game now. In this section we're going to be covering the following points. We're going to start off with a brief introduction to the trade network and trade nodes. We'll then touch on trade flow and look at trade steering. We'll then have a brief introduction to merchants, and at the end of the episode we'll just touch on a mechanic called trade winds. So for a start, we're in the wrong map mode. This is the political map mode. We need to bounce over to the trade map mode. And the way trade works in EU4 is global trade is compartmentalized into 77 static geographical locations, and these are called trade nodes. So they're all color-coded and named for the user's convenience. It's pretty intuitive. As we start to zoom in, we can see these lines and arrows moving around all over the surface of the planet. It looks horrendously overwhelming, but it's very simple, very straightforward. And as we can start to zoom in, the trade nodes start to become a little bit clearer, and we've got all of these lines moving in to and out of the trade nodes. So these are called trade routes. So if we take Gujarat as an example here, we've got 3 trade routes moving into Gujarat and 3 trade routes moving out of Gujarat. Not every trade node is the same, they all function the same, but they have different trade routes. So if we hop over to Basra, it only has 1 incoming trade route, but it has 2 outgoing trade routes. And it's just a case of getting to know the nodes around you and how you want to manipulate them. Trade does typically flow from east to west in this game, so if we just zoom out again. So all of the trade value naturally flows from east to west and tends to end up in one of 3 end nodes. Now, these 3 end nodes are quite special. They have the highest kind of potential of wealth in the game, and those nodes are Genoa, Venice, and the English Channel. So it's important just to keep those 3 nodes in mind. How we move our trade wealth around is something called trade steering. So when you want to move trade wealth from one node to another, you simply have to choose which trade path is going to suit your needs better. And the way that we interact with the network to do this is we use merchants. So merchants are at the top of the screen here. And it will tell you how many merchants you can have in your empire. We'll cover how to get merchants, more merchants, later on in a different episode, but for now you start off the game with 2 merchants, but right now I've got 10. So as you go through the game, obviously your trade network gets much bigger and vastly more profitable. So when you've got a spare merchant, simply click on a trade node. So let's just come down here. I'm not here at the minute. I don't have a presence in this trade node right now. And we've got 2 options. We've got collect from trade and transfer trade power. So most of the time, particularly in mid and late games, once you have an established trade base and it's more profitable to use transfer trade, you will preference to use transfer trade, but you can collect from any trade node. So if I send a merchant to this trade node here, he's gonna go to this trade node and he's simply going to take the money that we're entitled to in this trade node. If I tell him to transfer trade power, he will transfer wealth from this trade node to another trade node. And from this one, we have 3 options. And we can click here which trade route we want to send the trade wealth into. Now, generally speaking, the game does know, it works out which way you want it to go, and it will send it that way automatically, but you do have the options to change it if you want to be a bit different with something. So also worth mentioning here, if we just head up to our capital node. So a capital node is where you collect your trade income from. It's located within the node where your capital city is. It's very self-explanatory, right? So right now I'm playing as the Ottoman Empire, so my capital node is Constantinople. Now, a unique feature about a player's capital node is that you automatically collect money from this trade node without a merchant. It's the only node in the game that will do that for you. You can move your capital node. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's just something worth pointing out. You do not need a merchant in your capital node to collect money. Although if you do use a merchant in your capital node, you'll get a bonus for it, which again, we'll talk about in another episode. And that's where we're going to wrap up the first 3 points of the episode. Just to emphasize that everything we've covered so far is really just basics and simple things that we're going to layer on top of in the future when we cover more things and when we look at some of the topics that we've already covered but in more detail. So the last thing to talk about in this episode is a mechanic called trade winds, which is essentially something that the game implements to kind of try and mimic Earth's Coriolis effect. So we've got these little arrows here which indicate the mechanic trade wind. Now, of course, as the name might imply, these trade winds can change direction. Now, what they do is they affect trade range and also colonial range. But for this episode, we only care about trade range. So this can expand or decrease your trade range. So in some situations in the past, I've sent a merchant off to a far and distant trade node, and he's come home without me recalling him. So I've scratched my head and thought, what on earth's going on here? So essentially, this is what happened. The trade wind changed direction, and merchants that I had out on mission were returned because the change in the trade range kicked them out of the trade node. So it's just something to bear in mind. There's absolutely nothing you can do to influence this mechanic. It's there for the entirety of the game. You just gotta, well, I say deal with it, but it doesn't really hinder you too much. And there are things you can do to increase your trade range as well, which we'll talk about in another episode. I'm just having a quick look around actually, just to see if trade winds pop up anywhere else, or if it's literally just off the west coast of Africa. I think it might just be off the west coast of Africa. Alright, anyway. I hope you enjoyed this episode, guys. Please don't forget to go to the thumbs up if you found it helpful. And leave a comment if you've got any questions. And guys, take care. Have a great day. I'll catch you in the next episode.